By the summer of 1778, the British troops in the American colonies were seriously waning in confidence. Some men had been here fighting in the war for 3 years or more, and what did they have to show for it? A few victories, some territory gained, but at the cost of thousands of dead soldiers and an enemy now rejuvenated, having joined forces with a formidable ally.
Whilst British morale was dwindling, Washington's Continental Army was bolstered by the arrival of French ships and troops along the eastern seaboard. With the Royal Navy now under threat, the balance of power had truly shifted. If British commanders were to keep the colonies, they had to destroy Washington's force, and destroy it quickly. But how? In the second episode of our 2-part series on the American Revolution, in collaboration with Survive History, I'll continue my journey with the 33rd Regiment of Foot, the Pattern, as we continue the fight to protect Britain's empire across the Atlantic. Stationed at the front line of the action, I'll discover the harsh reality of late 18th century warfare.
Please tell me, for those sorts of amputations, lads wouldn't have just been biting down on something.
I'm afraid so.
How musket balls and bayonets weren't the only threats to your survival.
The soldiers' wives, they weren't shrinking violets. A little bit of a law unto themselves.
Yeah.
The consequences of taking your life into your own hands.
That thing stings. It really does.
It's a brutal implement.
And what the chances were you'd make it out alive. So the question is, could you survive as a British Redcoat in the American War of Independence?
After 8 months occupying the city of Philadelphia, the decision was finally made to move out of the city by a certain Sir Henry Clinton, the new Commander-in-Chief in North America.
In the previous winter, General Howe had sent in his resignation letter to Britain. No support from the government was his primary reason. By April 1778, a replacement had been found. Henry Clinton, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, already with great experience in the colonies, having commanded alongside Howe in the victory at Long Island, assumed command of the British Army, with strict orders to strengthen areas under British control, despite receiving a smaller number of reinforcements. With the French now having entered the conflict, as many as 5,000 troops were even removed from Clinton's disposal and relocated to protect the islands in the Caribbean. The first task Clinton faced was to move his army out of the former seat of Congress. Nothing had been yielded from the occupation, with the legislative body functioning perfectly well elsewhere, and the threat of a French expeditionary force landing further north threatening New York. The new commander's hand was forced. The army now faced a daunting task. Heavily encumbered by its supplies and baggage, it had to attempt what Howe had deemed impossible in 1777, a 100-mile overland march between Philadelphia and New York. Progress would be slow and methodical. The 33rd formed part of one of the Army's 2 total divisions, some 10,500 individuals, including 350 female camp followers. No one could have possibly known what was in store for them.
The The 33rd spearheaded the march alongside the Jaegers and the pioneers who worked tirelessly to make sure the route was navigable. Behind them came the infantry, cavalry, artillery train, baggage, cattle, and the 5th Brigade, who acted as a rear guard. And they marched for days, first in torrential rainstorms and then in the excessive heat, with temperatures sometimes exceeding 38 degrees centigrade. Men were dropping down all the time and dying of heat exhaustion. And to make matters worse, Continentals had left these leaflets warning the Redcoats that they might be burgoyned, the new term describing the surrounding and cutting off of a British army.
Many men fell and lost their lives miserably because of the intense heat and due to the sandy ground which we crossed, a pathless brushwood where no water was to be found on the entire march.
It wasn't just the heat. The sandy pathways caused many transports to become stuck or broken, while swarms of mosquitoes from the neighbouring swamplands were a plague upon the soldiers. After a horrendous week-long march, members of the 33rd began their approach to New York. The road networks forced the divisions to follow the same route, forming a column 12 miles long, moving painfully slow. Washington sensed the army's vulnerability and trailed the Redcoats, steadily gaining ground in anticipation of a general engagement. On the 26th of June, Clinton chose to pause his march and have the army camp in Monmouth, a few miles short of his destination.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
I've just come off from a absolutely gruelling march and I am in desperate need of some sustenance. Tell me, what's on the menu?
You've come to the right place. So, soldiers' diet varied hugely depending on time of year, where you were in the world, and what was available. But what we've got here is a good selection of the sort of things that soldiers would expect on home service. And at the very heart of the ration was a pound of meat, which we can see just here. We've got a pound of fresh meat, so that would be a daily ration of
daily
beef.
ration, okay, that's quite generous.
And then you'd get a pound of bread as well. We have oatcakes, which was used as a supplement to the bread ration, often used as part of the recruiting pull. You know, joining the army, we keep you fed.
And at this point in the war, obviously they've still shipping in food from Britain, but at some point, especially when it comes to these long marches, they're going to have to forage a little bit. They're going to have to live off the land, as they say. How does that affect the diet? What kind of new foodstuffs are the British soldiers eating?
Well, the army was very keen that the soldiers were supplementing their meat ration with vegetables. Once we get to America, step this way, obviously local produce plays a lot more of a role. Potatoes in various forms were very common. Often we think of the white potato that we're used to today, but what we would know as sweet potatoes were common. And then we've got maize, and there's accounts of soldiers using their canteens and punching holes in them and using it to grind the corn to create essentially a corn meal. But once they're in the Americas, one of the things that they actually realised was that they became very reliant on supplies from Britain. And that transformed the fresh meat and bread ration to what was known as salt rations. So what we've got here, instead of fresh beef or mutton or pork, is a salt pork ration. This has been packed in a barrel in salt and salt brine, maybe some months, possibly even years old. We're in a period before refrigeration, so salt is the main preservative, or simply drying the food. So that takes us to the equivalent bread ration. So here we can see ship's biscuits. Feel free to have a try.
I have tried a few of these before. I know they're going to break my teeth. Yeah, it's just so you've got to dip it in something.
Another interesting preserved food stuff is this. This is portable soup, dried essence of beef. And this was hugely popular because it's obviously very light and could be purchased privately. So an officer may well take in stocks of this. And all you do is add boiling water and it turns into beef stock. And it was used as a basis of soups. It was particularly popular with invalids. And you would obviously then supplement that with local vegetables and any other things that were available.
So it's basically like that's the first thing when I smelt it. It just smells like a stock cube, essentially.
Exactly.
So it seemed the Redcoat soldier had a slightly more balanced diet than we might expect, mixing army provisions with local produce. Once the ingredients were supplied, a designated cook within each mess of between 5 to 10 men would make the meals for the soldiers, all to be washed down with the popular rum ration, a tot or two within a 2-pint canteen of water. It is estimated that from 1777 onwards, the British Army in North America was consuming over 360,000 gallons of rum a year.
Well, Tom, it looks like those two in the corner have had a bit too much of the rum ration. If I just make my way around. Jo, you are a wife of one of the soldiers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, any woman who was officially part of the army was definitely married to one of the soldiers. It wasn't wholly encouraged for the soldiers to marry because it was considered to be a distraction.
Yes, yeah.
But women were kind of, I think there's a lovely quote about women, a sober and industrious woman is quite an asset to a company. Women were allowed to go along with the troops. They were billeted with the troops in garrisons as they went. But again, women would go along on the campaigns because they were needed for nursing. So mopping brows, feeding, cleaning up, changing bandages, things like that.
And was it mainly the officers who would be bringing their wives, or could it be a soldier of any rank?
It was probably unlikely that the officers took their wives because they would prefer the home comforts and the safety of being at home.
Of course, yes, all right.
Whereas the soldiers' wives were a bit more intrepid,
Yeah.
took their own share of carrying things, making sure things moved along, did their fair share of looting as well, if they could. The main thing that women did was actually laundry, because that's something that I think men have never ever managed to do for themselves. So that was the women's main job, was laundry, and they would be paid per soldier 4p a week. And sometimes that would be taken out of the soldier's wages, and sometimes it would be up to the individual soldier to pay up.
So it would make sense. Let's say you were very fond of your husband and you wanted to join him. You didn't want to stay in England whilst he was abroad, but you could also make a wage from it as well.
Yes.
Would children be coming along
Yes.
as well?
Yes.
Right.
Everybody had a job, and so they had to be useful. The army couldn't take anybody along who wasn't going to be a useful person.
I'm sure at some points there must have been some awkward, uncomfortable situations with a load of men who potentially haven't seen a woman in a long, long time. There must have been some uncomfortable situations.
I suspect there very much was, but then that's kind of what the unofficial camp followers are for, to kind of dispel that.
Right, you distinguish yourselves from that.
Yeah, oh, very much so.
Yeah.
And I think the soldiers' wives were quite tough. I mean, they weren't shrinking violets. They could probably give as good as they got. And there's a letter home from one of the officers about the women going and looting silk dresses from houses in the colonies and coming out with armfuls of silk dresses, and on being told to put them back, basically said in no uncertain terms, no.
It's not who we are.
It's not who we are. You know, this is the perk of the job.
Yeah, right.
So a little bit of a law unto themselves.
Yeah, but they're very much, at the end of the day, they're very much part of the regiment. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Jo. I'm going to go and help myself to some of this delicious food whilst I can.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
The soldiers had little time to enjoy their provisions and rest. Many were sent out on picket duty, whilst rebel forces were gearing up for a battle by the town of Monmouth. On the 28th of June, Washington attacked. For the units engaged, the fighting was intense. A British newspaper spoke of soldiers spent with heat, thirst and fatigue, claiming that they had expended from 80 to 90 rounds in a short time. Some newly recruited troops encountered rebel-like cavalry for the first time, and hundreds were captured and taken prisoner. Captain Dancy was close to becoming one of them.
I had a very narrow escape from being taken prisoner with my whole company. We were obliged to run up to our middles in a bog to get away from the rebel light horse, and luckily, I only had one man taken.
Neither side could claim victory in a battle which would be the last major engagement in the Northern Theatre for close to 2 years. Washington actively avoided entering into the Sandy Hook Bay area, which was a well-fortified loyalist enclave, whilst Clinton's forces withdrew to New York, still cautious of a possible French expeditionary force. When they arrived in the city, transported from Sandy Hook by the Royal Navy, no expeditionary force was to be found. What they saw was far more sinister. Off the coast, a powerful fleet emerged, flying the white standards of the King of France. Dispatched from Toulon in April, the 12 ships of the line and 6 frigates had arrived just a few days too late to cut the entire army off from New York.
The appearance of the old enemy caused a considerable stir amongst the army and navy. Desperate measures were made to crew Vice Admiral Lord Richard Howe's outnumbered fleet, and batteries were laid to barrage any ships that dared to cross the bar of Sandy Hook. But just like that, the French fleet vanished.
The abrupt disappearance of the French was something of an anticlimax, but the encounter was sure to send shivers down the spine of the pattern. The next year would be considerably quieter for the 33rd, with only a limited number of skirmishes and operations. But for many, the war was really now starting to take its toll. Whilst men such as Dancy longed to be reunited with their partners back in England and lamented the war's interruption of his plans to marry, others became disillusioned with the conflict and soon began to disregard the rules of war. A young John Robert Shaw, who had been recruited into the 33rd and had finally reached the colonies by 1778, was yet to witness combat of any kind until the night of the 27th of September. After learning that a small force of roughly 100 Continental Army dragoons were billeted in barns along the road at Old Tappan, a British force led by Major General Grey surrounded the area in the dead of night, entered the farmhouses and put the rebel soldiers to the bayonet before they could fully awake. The scenes were horrific, as John Robert Shaw, one of the soldiers of the 33rd who arrived as the bloody business was coming to a close, described in his memoirs.
As we approached, the shrieks and screams of the helpless victims, whom our savage fellow soldiers were butchering, were sufficient to have melted into compassion the heart of a Turk or a Tartar. Tongue cannot tell, nor pen unfold the horrors of that dismal night. Some were seen having their arms cut off, and others with their bowels hanging out, crying for mercy.
This was the new reality of a conflict that had dragged on for over 4 years. Despite reinforcements arriving, albeit slowly, even those within Cornwallis's prestigious 33rd were struggling to envisage a British victory. They had also seen far too many of their fellow soldiers die to view the American colonists as proper enemies, deserving of the rules of war, let alone as fellow subjects of the crown. The year of 1779 had seen the 33rd hold fort in New York and wait out a potential counterattack by Washington's Continental Army. No such attack ever came. Instead, a deadly outbreak of disease plagued the Redcoats in the late summer. What appears to have been dysentery, a severe infection of the intestines, possibly brought over on the troop transports carrying reinforcements. Over 5,000 soldiers were struck down with fatalities ranging from 25 to 60% of men per regiment. It was not just dysentery that spread throughout the ranks. Remitting fevers such as malaria were common, accounting for a quarter of all fevers contracted throughout the war. And so too were inflammatory diseases such as scurvy, rheumatism and tuberculosis, often referred to as consumption. Despite the fatal outbreaks, it seemed for a while that another quiet winter was in the offing. In reality, it would be anything but. Rumours that the interminable deadlock in the north could only be broken by moving south soon became orders, with the regiments embarking the day after Christmas on ships heading down the Atlantic seaboard to Charleston.
Having intentionally landed south of the port of Charleston in the winter before successfully besieging the city in the late spring, Cornwallis was ordered to chase after retreating Continentals making their way into South Carolina. Now, whilst the conventional thinking at the time was that the British could turn the Southern Colonies into loyalist enclaves, Clinton didn't share the same strategic priorities. He truly believed the only way to beat Washington was through a battle of annihilation.
Washington was not in South Carolina. He was further north, and so Clinton left once again with the bulk of his army to the vicinity of New York. But he left Cornwallis behind with instructions to continue to oversee the expansion of royal authority in the south. Also left behind, the 33rd Regiment of Foot. Cornwallis's first target was the largest settlement in South Carolina's interior, Camden, a trade hub located beside the watery river. It was earmarked to become a vital supply base and staging post for further Crown forces' expansion west into the uplands. The area was key strategically, possessing good communications with numerous wagon roads built to service the plantation economy, as well as a large number of rivers and streams that could be traversed by boat. It had to be secured. Again, as spring turned into summer, disease yet again hindered Cornwallis's army. Smallpox, malaria and other fevers infected numerous regiments, leading in some cases to as many as 1 in 3 soldiers being taken out of action. The climate in South Carolina had reduced Cornwallis's already small fighting force to levels that would leave them extremely vulnerable to rebel attacks.
Cornwallis wouldn't have much time for self-pity. Major General Horatio Gates, victor at Saratoga, was closing in on the settlement with a force that outnumbered his 2-1. Cornwallis had 2,000 effective, and many of those men were still recovering from their diseases. Nonetheless, on the 16th of August 1780, the battle lines were drawn, with the 33rd and the 23rd Fusiliers, headed by Lieutenant Colonel James Webster, and rearguarded by Tarleton's Legion, prepared to face the enemy head-on.
Both leaders ordered their troops to attack, thinking their opposition had yet to fully deploy. The 800 or so strong 33rd Regiment and 23rd Fusiliers advanced rapidly towards the 2,500 soldiers in the Virginia and North Carolina militia. Continental artillery opened fire on the advanced Crown forces using case shot, blasting cylinders of musket balls like giant shotguns, cutting down large numbers of redcoats.
The enemy surpassed us in artillery and threw in horrid showers of grape. This chiefly fell on ours and the 33rd Regiment, and were cut off amazingly.
Despite taking large casualties, Webster's force continued. The opposing militia were under instruction to reserve fire until they were given the command when the redcoats were firmly in range. Unnerved with the rapid approach of the 33rd, one member of the militia, William Gibson, panicked.
I can state on oath that I believe my gun was the first gun fired. And I fired without thinking, except that I might prevent the man opposite from killing me.
With that, the entire line let loose a volley before the approaching force was within range. The 33rd made sure not to make the same mistake by throwing away their shots. John Robert Shaw recalled how the pattern approached 100 yards away from the militiamen, returned fire and immediately charged on them with the bayonet. Having never used their bayonets before, the militia fled almost instantaneously. In fact, so eager to flee from the battlefield, Gates noted that many actually ran into the British.
The impetuosity in which they advanced, firing and huzzaing through the whole body of the militia was such a panic that they generally threw down their loaded arms and fled in the utmost consternation. The unworthy example of the Virginians was almost instantly followed by the North Carolinians.
With that, the American left wing started to collapse. But now, with Cornwallis's loyalist provincials and Irish volunteers starting to cave, the 33rd had to worry about salvaging their own left flank. This was easier said than done, with many of the men scattered in the woods. Luckily, reforming the line, wheeling left, and then pressing onto a further attack in the midst of the stifling heat and smoke required the steadiness the regulars were renowned for. As the 33rd began to assail the left flank of the Continental force, Cornwallis unleashed Tarleton's dragoons, who broke through the redcoat ranks and swept through the now routing rebel army. The Legion lived up to its deadly reputation as it pursued the scattering militia for miles, looting Gates's baggage as they went. Victory declared in our favour, Shaw wrote. A victory it may have been, but the casualty statistics were horrific. Virtually half of the entire 33rd Regiment had been killed or wounded. Makeshift military hospitals would be the location many soldiers ended up in after the battle had concluded.
So we're going to need to go to the surgeon.
Sergeant.
Hello.
Battle of Camden, a monumental victory, but
It certainly was.
It's the costliest in terms of casualties for the 33rd throughout the entire war.
Absolutely, it's their glorious day and their deadliest day. It's 15 killed in action, 75 plus wounded.
Wow, and you know, those numbers might sound sort of insignificant in modern warfare, but back at the time, in terms of battalion sizes in the south, they're losing men every day. That's a hugely significant percentage.
Absolutely, the battalion size would normally have been if it were 650 or thereabouts, but they're down to about 200, 220.
Wow. Okay, so dwindling every day. And in terms of the battlefield injuries themselves. Give me an idea of the atmosphere. Where would the wounded soldiers have been brought after the battle, and what was the general feeling like within these hot medical tents?
Well, you've got to remember, it's who's got the field at the end of the day. So the British wounded would have been gathered as best possible. Very rudimentary regimental aid posts, I suppose, would have been set up. Men brought back on blankets, and then into the camp. The wounded are being dragged in by their comrades onto the blankets and ready for the regimental surgeon and mates to see.
You can imagine the smells itself in the tents is going to be pretty nasty.
The battalion was in a particularly bad way. Before Camden, they were noted their clothes. They hadn't had new clothes, so they were in the dirty clothes, which are not going to help, especially with gunshot wounds. No, in the chances of infection. And you mentioned gunshot wounds. Is that the primary battlefield injury that these soldiers have? Yeah, so you've got high impact sort of trauma with lead balls, in which lead being a soft metal tends to, if it hits the bone, it smashes out. We've got the lists of the men from the 33rd and from other battalions within Cornwallis's army. This particular example there, Private Humphrey Johnson, he was a young lad, 17. We know he was hit in the thigh with a musket ball. We know afterwards he actually survived, probably as he's got age on his side. But this would have been, first of all, probed by the surgeon, probably with a finger in to feel that if bone had been splintered. The real danger here, Luke, is filthy, dirty clothes, rags being pushed in, pieces of leather, buttons, they pull buttons out, and so you've got to get that out because that creates the infection.
With almost half of their entire regiment either killed or wounded, it was imperative that the soldiers received urgent medical attention. But what exactly could be done in terms of treatment on campaign in the late 18th century?
And in terms of the treatment for these wounds, does it depend on the type of injury? Was there any pain relief at the time? Yes, there is pain relief, but it's limited. Remember, we're in the Carolinas. Cornwallis is moving fast, so each battalion has its own regimental surgeon and mate. It's not medical treatment as we would perceive a battlefield trauma casualties in a modern day. Pain relief, we've got Ordlum, it's a more for opiate type basis, generally reserved for officers and higher class. So the young soldiers don't get access to the best pain relief? That wound would not be, he'd been given any pain relief, that would be probed, and then if it needed amputation, then if he's lucky, if it's to spare, he could have a draft of something, but generally it's biting on a leather. Wow, I was going to say, so no pain relief, no antibiotics, no sorts of... It doesn't exist. You can see how dirty your hands are. Yeah, and you mentioned amputations. They would have been fairly common throughout the war? Absolutely. They knew straight away, particularly with limb trauma, arm or leg, if a bone was shattered, it was pretty useless, so the surgeon would then declare to amputate. If this wound would be needed to be amputated, they'd always go above the wound. Right, yeah. So the cut would be made, tourniquets applied, and a specialist cut around. An amputation can sometimes need less than 30 seconds for the muscle groups to be taken back. The ligatures placed on the arteries, because remember, these are traumatic amputations, the cutting through, and then the bone cut and then the skin peeled round and then sutured very roughly and it then bandaged. And you mentioned earlier Cornwallis. At this point in the war, he starts to really turn up the dial in terms of the movement and speed of his troops. Absolutely. So some troops, if they're wounded, they might have to be left behind. They're left behind. We know some of the battalion wives were chosen out to act as nurses in supply depots. Men were put on barges to try and get back to Charleston. Some of those were even captured. I guess if anything, it might just be a mercy for some of the soldiers who are left in the camp. To a degree, if the war's over for them. If they've got that chance, and luckily, if he gets back to a port, he's shipped off, and then he will probably be able to claim a pension. Right. If he survives. Well, I'm sure we have a lot more marching ahead. I hope you get better, young sir, and we'll see you on the road. All right. See you soon. Right, Humphrey. Let's have a look at you.
Rebel militia had captured over 100 sick soldiers, being moved down to the PD River to receive treatment at Georgetown. When left unguarded, These men were easy prey for the partisans who constantly shadowed Cornwallis's army. It was becoming an extremely worrying pattern for the British. Hard-fought victory in pitched battle with a large number of casualties sustained, no capitalisation on the result. Cornwallis was hamstrung by the sick and wounded and could lead no successful pursuit of Gates's army. How many more battles could this army endure? More importantly, with a simple law of averages, how many more were they likely to win?
With the weather as it was in the Carolinas, no sooner did a campaigning season end than another was planned and swiftly put into motion. But another campaign meant a new strategy for Cornwallis. No longer was his army going to be slow and encumbered by the weight of its own supplies. If the British were to win the war, the rebels, often on the run, would have to be completely destroyed.
This new strategy commenced with the dispatch of Tarleton to chase down partisan commander Daniel Morgan, who had been sent by Nathaniel Greene overseeing the southern department of the Continental Army to threaten the British line of supply. Itching to follow with the main bulk of his army, Cornwallis had to wait for fresh troops. New recruits, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie, who had commanded a raiding force down from New York to Virginia to divert attention from Cornwallis's army struggling with fever in the late summer. By the time Leslie had finally reached the general, disaster had struck. An overly eager and brash Tarleton, convinced as ever in his own abilities, had hunted down Morgan and thrown himself against the rebels' combined force of militia and Continentals without waiting for Cornwallis. The result was the Battle of Cowpens, where Tarleton's command of just over 1,000 men was routed. A clash of such a modest size may have been considered a skirmish in the northern colonies, but in the south, where the tiny number of Crown forces was already stretched so thin, it was a grievous blow.
Here comes Tarleton's Legion. John, what happened at Cowpens?
Dark day for us, Luke, dark day for us. The Patriots played a blinder. They lured us into a charge. We lost a lot of good men out there. The way that General Morgan played on gallant Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton's aggressiveness, we charged, we saw the opportunity, they fell back, and it was just a trap.
And John, so Tarleton himself, there's a lot of Hollywood depictions of him being this sort of very aristocratic, out-of-touch leader. How fair is that depiction of him as a leader?
So he's actually from a merchant background. His family were merchant. He's joined the military. He's a very aggressive young man. Later on in his life, he goes on to be a general in other wars, resulting in being a member of Parliament and being knighted. Known for seizing the opportunity, use of initiative, very well respected by his commanders.
During the War of Independence, a lot of people forget that cavalry played a big part. Tarleton's Legion itself, how was it deployed and used on the battlefield?
So there was two parts to the Legion. There was the cavalry element, which was formed from the 16th Light Dragoons and also local loyalists. And there was a light infantry detachment as well. They generally operated in smaller groups for harassing and raiding the enemy. A lot of aggressive techniques.
Yeah, and in general, a lot of people, when they think about the War of Independence, they don't necessarily think that the cavalry was too much involved in all the battles, but they did play a big part in most of the big engagements.
Yes, they did, yes. So because of the terrain, it was predominantly light cavalry that was used. There wasn't necessarily the space that they had in the European battlefields for regimental charges. So they operated on a troop basis, more coming together. They were still shock troops where they would be used for the charge and to exploit gaps in the enemy's line and harass any retreating or moving enemies.
And of course, on the battlefield, you had quite the presence because of your uniforms and the hats.
100%, yes. A lot of galloping horses towards you, with all the men looking ferocious and dashing at the same time, would certainly put the fear of God into the enemy, especially that professional look of, actually, these guys are here and they know what they're doing, they're here to do business. That combined with the horses who's galloping towards you would take a lot of guts to stand still for that.
Well, as dashing as your uniform is, I think it's about time that you headed back to camp to reflect on your defeat.
See you back at camp.
See ya. Leslie's troops actually arrived roughly the same time that Tarleton's disgraced survivors came straggling back in. Cornwallis was now desperate to avenge the defeat, and he amassed his army to head after the rebel partisan leader. There was only one problem. He went the wrong way.
In hindsight, it was a far more critical error than the general could have ever imagined. Believing that Morgan was circling south, the Redcoats were ordered over Buffalo Creek and the Little Broad River in pursuit, whereas Morgan, in fact, headed over the Catawba and into western North Carolina. Even after Cornwallis realised his error, Crown forces could only manage a pace of 72 miles per week, compared to Morgan's 100 miles in 5 days. Desperate times called for desperate measures.
An increasingly frustrated Cornwallis was desperate to avenge Tarleton's defeat at Cowpens, but unfortunately for him, he was about to engage in an ever more agonising strategic game of cat and mouse. Morgan was evading his army entirely, and Greene was tactically retreating up into the relatively safe haven colony of Virginia. In order to get there, he'd have to cross the Dan River. Cornwallis intended to stop him, but in order to do so, he'd have to speed up.
With Morgan at least 2 days ahead, the general decided upon a bold expedient. To convert his army into a light, highly manoeuvrable and agile striking force, he ordered the baggage train to be torched. Only wagons with hospital stores, salt, ammunition, and a few reserved for carrying sick and wounded were spared. This was a huge gamble, but one Cornwallis was willing to take in order to win the race to the Dan. Men were warned that the delivery of provision would be very irregular. They were to live off the land and forage as best they could, maintaining good levels of cleanliness and discipline, despite the arduous chase northwards. The Redcoats followed the rebel trail for weeks, crossing the Catawba late in January and the Yadkin early in February. The 33rd were occasionally met with rebel militia resistance, trying to slow the pursuit, and found settlements abandoned with only a handful of loyalists left, extremely sick in jails, with barely any water or provisions to survive. The signs showed that Cornwallis was getting very close, but the difficulties of living off the land were beginning to tell, with outright looting becoming more commonplace. To combat this, strict orders were given, warning that any officer who looks on with indifference and does not do his utmost to prevent the shameful marauding which has of late prevailed in the army will be considered in a more criminal light than the persons who commit the scandalous crimes. It was when Crown forces entered an area of North Carolina settled by the Moravians, famed for their distilling of whiskey, that these orders would be truly put to the test. One day in early February, John Robert Shaw and the 33rd pitched up for the night near the settlements of Salem, Hope, and Bethabara.
We were encamped on a rising ground, contiguous to one of these Moravian towns, the inhabitants of which were very generous in rolling out their whiskey barrels to make us drunk.
The regiment's discipline, strained by hard marches through mud and rain, and the interminable crossings of rivers and creeks, broke down.
There were not 50 sober men among us. We had suffered much for a want of drink, as well as through fatigue.
After a heavy night on the drink, I thought I'd catch up with Tom Whitfield to find out just how chaotic the situation was in the late winter of 1781.
Morning. Well, Tom, some of these men, they've been fighting in the colonies for close to 5 years. They're going to let their hair down occasionally, aren't they?
Occasionally, yeah. You know, it's hard fighting they've been doing. It takes its toll, so the men have to, take a bit of time to themselves, have a bit of time off, and they do that in a number of ways. The soldiers' favourite pastime, it's always been, and you'll know yourself, is drinking.
Yeah, I know from last night.
Yeah, drinking, smoking, anything that you can sort of get your hands on, and then just to take the edge off for a minute, and then have a bit of R&R time to yourself.
In terms of mixing with locals, we were partying a bit with some Moravians last night. How often did soldiers out on campaign actually mix with the locals and engage with them?
I think it very much depends on sort of the nature of the campaign. As you say, last night a few Moravians were out and about. We're in New York, for example. We're in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
It all merges into one of these big cities. But yeah, you're bound to bump into people. You're bound to sort of be interacting with the local populace. Some of them are friendly, some of them less so. It's completely mixed bag.
And I can imagine mixing with locals, mixing drink with soldiers who've been together for years and years in a hot climate. There's gonna at some point be some bust-ups.
It's a really masculine community. Is sort of army life. It is a community, and it does take. There are women, there are children, there are locals, but you're spending all day, every day, essentially with the same bunch of lads, and tensions are going to flare. So there's quite a famous account from a soldier in the 33rd, John Robert Shaw, in which he gets into it with a fellow, with one of his comrades. He comes away and he goes to the sergeant and he says, "Sergeant, look, I've had a bit of a set to with your lad." And he said, "Look, you're going to have to go and you're going to have to fight him."
No way.
You're going to have to fight him, and you're going to have to make him, respect you.
Also,
otherwise, he's not going to respect you.
Prove your masculinity.
It's almost proving masculinity. It's sort of, it is that, very much that. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. At this point in the war, Cornwallis is becoming increasingly frustrated. He's lost the race to the Dan. Green has managed to cross it. In terms of the morale in camp and the discipline, it's starting to fail and falter slightly, isn't it? There's a bit of looting.
I think it's been a hard campaign. Tempers are flaring, and are we taking out a little bit on the public? Maybe.
As you probably would. So frustrated.
There's we know Cornwallis, for example, sent out orders essentially saying to officers that if any officers are known to be turning a blind eye to looting, or other outrages committed against the local population, that they will also be tried. So we know that the officers are sort of maybe semi-complicit in some of it, because they're recognising that their men's tempers are being stretched to breaking point, and something needs to be done.
You said tried.
Tried, yeah.
Discipline. What are the punishments for looting? I suppose it depends what the crime is, but say some soldiers were looting, and in some cases they're deserting as well. What are the punishments for that sort of behaviour?
The maximum punishment, obviously, that the army can avoid is death, but it's not common, and punishment is meted out by the regimental court-martial system. So there is a balance. It's not just on the spot executions. But by and large, your most common punishment is flogging. It's the drummer boys lashing you while you're stripped to the waist.
What are they lashing you with?
They are lashing you with one of these.
Oh, Jesus.
So this is the cat o' nine tails. Very simple device.
Used in the Navy as well?
Used in the Navy as well.
Yeah, that thing stings. It really does.
Yeah. It's a brutal implement, and its use varies across regiments as to how liberally it gets used. Some regiments, use it very liberally. Others sort of tend to use it more sparingly. Mm-hmm. We know, for example, that quite often if a man is sentenced to be flogged, sometimes it's commuted. So the commanding officer of the regiment or the court marshal will say he's flogged, but extenuating X, Y, and Z. So he's broken the law, but X, Y, and Z extenuating circumstances, and either it gets carried out partially or more, or sometimes cancelled altogether.
The 33rd suffered roughly 100 desertions over the 8 years they spent in North America, a figure largely in line with other British regiments during the war. There were cases like that of William Walsh, who deserted to join the Continental Army. Others chose to simply disappear into the countryside.
In the case of John Robert Shaw, you mentioned him earlier, he actually does desert at one point. What do we know of his final days of the war? He does switch sides, doesn't he?
He does. Well, by his own account, he gets captured. He goes out foraging. It's been a long campaign, and the men are hungry and they're tired and they're thirsty, and so he goes out to try and augment his diet, his living, with another soldier. And while they're out there, they run into a troop of American dragoons and get captured. Now, Robert Shaw, according to his account, he's not hugely cut up by this. The soldier he's with, however, is a lot more distressed by having been captured. So is Robert Shaw, is it a fortunate occasion which has allowed him to desert? Maybe. Has he actually gone out looking to desert? Yeah. Maybe. Has he just been captured?
Who knows? Who knows, Tom?
Had Shaw deserted or been captured? The line was a thin one. Unlike his fellow escapee, Shaw admitted to a sense of relief when he discovered his fate. It seems as though the hard campaigning had eroded his will to carry on. The two prisoners were questioned by Greene, then conducted into captivity. The end of Shaw's service had come at a fortuitous time. Cornwallis, realising that his army was slowly wasting away and that Greene's was constantly being reinforced, resolved to force the issue and end the impasse that had developed. Greene, too, anxious his army was swelled by a questionably loyal militia, wished for a decisive pitched battle. He believed himself on the cusp of a second Saratoga, and not without reason. He had lured Cornwallis far from his supply lines into a showdown that, if it resulted in a defeat, would almost certainly lead to the ruination of the small, tired and hungry royal force. On the 15th of March 1781, Cornwallis's men formed their line at Guilford Courthouse, having marched 4 miles from the west at daybreak when they verified Greene's position. The deployment was organised with tranquility and order, and both sides braced themselves for a long and bloody battle. Again, the 33rd found themselves in the woods to the left of Cornwallis's flank, with the 23rd beside them, commanded by Webster. Opposite them was a line of militiamen, occupying some rail fences at the far side of the fields adjacent to the woodland.
When arrived within 40 yards of the enemy's line, it was perceived that their whole force had their arms presented and resting on a rail fence, the common partitions in America. They were taking aim with the nicest precision. At this awful period, a general pause took place. Both parties surveyed each other for the moment with the most anxious suspense. Nothing speaks until Colonel Webster came forward in front of the 23rd Regiment, and said, "Come on, my brave Fusiliers." This operated like an inspiring voice. They rushed forward amidst the enemy's fire. Dreadful was the havoc on both sides.
The 23rd and 71st suffered heavily from the militia's fusillade, but returned fire and charged with bayonets. The 33rd, trying to hold contact with this force, was also preoccupied with an overwhelming presence of militia and riflemen in the woods. The extent of the Continental right flank was so vast that the 33rd was forced to detach a fair distance from the 23rd, who were now also engaging in vicious woodland skirmishes. A gap appeared between the two regiments, leading Cornwallis to ride into the woods to maintain the cohesion, much as he had done at Camden. In the process, the general had 2 horses shot beneath him and required Sergeant Roger Lamb to rescue him. Fierce fighting raged on as the 33rd continued to show great bravery, employing their bayonets to clear the trees of riflemen and push them eastwards. As they emerged from the woods for the first time, it seemed as though 2 pieces of enemy artillery had been left exposed without protection. These hopes were painfully disabused as multiple regiments of Virginian and Maryland Continentals appeared and fired a deadly volley, initiating a retreat of the Redcoats. It was at this point that Webster was struck by a musket ball straight through the joint of his knee. He screamed for his men to lie down to avoid the case shot fired by Samuel Finley's battery. What ensued was one of the most ferocious moments in the war. Both sides looked to press home the advantage, but were repelled by enemy volleys. Eventually, more units joined the epicenter of the battle, and a grand melee broke out. All soldiers fighting with bayonets, sabres, and in some cases, fists. With more and more Crown forces joining the scene, and a heavily disputed claim that Cornwallis was happy to see his artillery fire into the mix of soldiers, Greene pulled his troops away. A scene of horror was left on the battlefield, with the butcher's bill yet again being particularly bad for the 33rd. Some estimates show the British as having lost almost 27% of their entire force. Lieutenant Colonel James Webster would die of his injury in the fortnight that followed the battle. When Cornwallis learnt of his death, the general was struck with such pungent sorrow that, turning to himself, he looked at his sword and emphatically exclaimed, "I have lost my scabbard." Beyond the personal and human loss, the 33rd, not to mention Cornwallis's Southern Army as a whole, had been deprived of one of its most capable officers. The immediate aftermath of the battle was grim, with soldiers sleeping under no shelter, among the wounded and dying.
The result was a victory, but it was most certainly a Pyrrhic one. Cornwallis knew that. Over the next few days, he pondered his next steps. In a letter to fellow friend and officer William Phillips, he explained, "Now, my dear friend, what is our plan? Without one, we cannot succeed, and I assure you that I am quite tired of marching about the country in quest of adventures. If we mean an offensive war in America, we must abandon New York, bring our whole force into Virginia. Then we have a state to fight for, and a successful battle may bring us America. But if our plan is merely defensive, let us quit the Carolinas and stick to our salt pork at New York, sending now and then a detachment to steal tobacco." So, 2 options. Either way, his force was certainly not staying put in North Carolina.
Another long march was inevitable. Cornwallis mustered an army of just over 2,000 troops on the 15th of April, and orders were given to gather supplies of rum, salt and flour. Their target, the colonial capital at Williamsburg, 250 miles away. Cornwallis had chosen the offensive approach, praying for one final stand to win America. He was to have his wish granted 5 months later, as his force, knackered again from a long summer march, converged on the settlement of Yorktown, hoping to find a population more willing to cooperate and assist Crown soldiers. The 23rd, 33rd, 43rd, 71st and Guards numbered scarcely 500 men fit for duty due to the extreme heat, dirty water and lack of medical supplies. Once they had settled the area, work began on the city's defences, but progress was slow due to the extremely hot weather conditions. Adding to Cornwallis's problems was the crushing news that Washington had travelled south from New York, not only with the main body of the Continental Army, but with French troops as well. Moreover, a powerful French fleet had appeared off the coast, cutting the Crown's land forces off from vital support and evacuation via the Royal Navy. The combined French and Continental assault proved too overwhelming for the British defenders. Day by day, fierce hand-to-hand combat ensued, with Washington's army battling inch by inch, redoubt by redoubt. Outnumbered 2-1, outgunned, and with a big portion of its force suffering from the effect of disease, fatigue and hunger, the Redcoats were soon pinned back and surrounded. Besides surrender, Cornwallis had one desperate option remaining: evacuate the main body of his army across the York River and attempt a breakout. This last glimmer of hope was snuffed out before preparations had barely begun, with a storm breaking out and making the crossing impassable. Cornwallis held a council of war with his officers. With low food, ammunition expended, defences pounded and a garrison ravaged by injury and sickness, it was agreed there was no other choice but surrender. The white flag was raised, the siege was over, and with it, the 33rd's last campaign in America.
Regiment by regiment, the Crown forces laid down their arms. Some supposedly throwing them down in frustration in order to break the weapons rather than surrender them. When you think some of these men would have been marching and fighting for over 5 years, with the end result being a crippling defeat, it must have been a truly bitter experience.
Whilst the surrender at Yorktown effectively ended all campaigning on the eastern seaboard, fighting raged on in other parts of the globe, and even along the frontiers of America, with natives backed by the British continuing to resist Washington's forces up until 1783, laying the seeds for further conflicts in the following decades. Most soldiers of the 33rd remained as prisoners of war until the end, with some still scattered throughout the country, often dealing with sickness or injury. William Dancy, now a major having returned from his leave, was given the thankless task of maintaining and regrouping the regiment. When the prisoners taken at Yorktown returned in 1783, Dancy reported that 27 were listed absent and was struck off the strength by a general order for not returning from captivity. Most of these men would have either been escapees who decided to settle down in America rather than make the arduous trek back to the Crown lines, or soldiers who chose to flee once they were released from American prisons. The life of a redcoat during the War of Independence had been extraordinary in every sense of the word, and the 33rd had been an exceptional regiment. Barring the retreat at Concord and the engagement at Bunker Hill, they had fought in every major battle, a record held by few other units.
I hope now that the blessings of peace are returned to the world, that we may spend many happy years.
So Luke, it's nice to do this again together. It's been a while, hasn't it? But as usual, my side won.
Listen, you have no idea what it was like to be a redcoat in this war, all right? It wasn't easy.
Well, if you want to find out what life was like for a British redcoat during the Revolutionary War, check out Luke's video on History Hit.
And vice versa, if you want to find out what life was like for a soldier in Washington's Continental Army, go check out the video series on Survive History.